Welcome to the USDA Food Safety and Inspection Services webinar on the voluntary labeling of FSIS regulated products with U.S. origin claims. My name is Dr. Beth McHugh, and I'm with the Labeling and Program Delivery staff within the Office of Policy and Program Development. These are the topics that we'll be discussing today. First, some background information and a brief overview of the final rule. Next, the presentation will go through each of the sections of the new regulations. And then we will provide some examples of the types of documentation that can be used to support U.S. origin claims. We've also compiled some of the more commonly asked questions that we've received about the final rule, and we will share those questions and answers with you today. I'll also speak briefly about the recently updated FSIS labeling compliance guideline. Let's start with some background information and an overview of the final rule. In March 2023, FSIS published a proposed rule in response to petitions and the public comments submitted in response to those petitions. FSIS also conducted a nationally representative consumer web-based survey for Product of USA labeling on meat products. And then on March 18, 2024, FSIS published the final rule, Voluntary Labeling of FSIS regulated products with U.S. origin claims. The voluntary label claims Product of USA and Made in the USA are allowed to be used to indicate that FSIS regulated products are of U.S. origin. This applies to products produced under mandatory inspection and those produced under voluntary inspection services. These claims are permitted when the product is derived from an animal born, raised, slaughtered, and processed in the United States. These claims are generically approved. As a reminder, generic approval means that labels bearing these claims do not have to be submitted to FSIS for a formal approval. In other words, the labels are approved if they bear all mandatory features. The label record must include adequate supporting documentation for these voluntary claims, and we'll discuss the types of records that may be used to support these claims later in the presentation. Products with label claims other than Product of USA and Made in the USA that indicate that a preparation or processing step of an FSIS regulated product is of U.S. origin are also generically approved for use. However, these claims will need to include preparation and processing steps that occurred in the United States upon which the claim is made. In order for single ingredient products to bear the Product of USA or Made in the USA claim, the product will need to meet the specific regulatory definition, which is that the product is derived from animals born, raised, slaughtered, and processed in the United States. For multi-ingredient products, in order to bear the Product of USA or Made in the USA claim, all FSIS regulated components of the product will need to meet the regulatory definition, meaning that they're derived from animals born, raised, slaughtered, and processed in the United States, and all ingredients except spices and flavorings will need to be of domestic origin. For the purposes of labeling multi-ingredient products with voluntary U.S. origin claims, such as Product of USA, spices and flavorings are defined in 9 CFR 317.2 F 1 I, A and B, and 381.118 C 1 and 2. This slide shows an example of a single ingredient pork product, pork chops, labeled with the claim Made in the USA. This label may be generically approved if the pork is from an animal born, raised, slaughtered, and processed in the United States, and if the labeling record includes sufficient information to support the claim. And we'll discuss more about documentation later in this presentation. On this slide, we have a multi-ingredient smoked sausage made with pork and beef with the claim Product of USA, which may be generically approved if all FSIS regulated ingredients, in this example beef and pork, are derived from animals born, raised, slaughtered, and processed in the United States. All other ingredients, other than spices and flavorings, are of domestic origin. All preparation and processing steps for the product occurred in the United States, and if the labeling record includes sufficient information to support the claim. And again, we'll discuss documentation later in the presentation. Factual U.S. origin claims other than product of USA and made in the USA may be made on labeling to designate the U.S. origin component of an FSIS regulated product's preparation and processing. These claims must include a description of the preparation and processing steps that occurred in the United States upon which the claim is made. The claim description is required to provide meaningful consumer information about the specific type of preparation and processing steps that occurred in the United States. For example, the generalized claims processed in the United States or manufactured in the United States are so broad as to not provide the consumer information about what preparation and processing steps occurred in the United States. Because the terms processed and manufactured do not convey specific steps, they can't be used. The next two slides provide examples of labels bearing meaningful consumer information that could be used. Here we have an example of a label for single ingredient pork tenderloin that has the claim sliced and packaged in the United States. This claim can be used provided the labeling record includes sufficient support that the product has been sliced and packaged in the United States. Next, we have another label example, this one for a chicken nugget type product that bears the statement made with chicken born and raised in the United States. This claim can be used provided the labeling record includes sufficient support that the chicken used in the product was derived from an animal born and raised in the U.S. Labels that make a factual claim about a specific U.S. state, territory, or locality may be used provided the claim meets the same requirements for use of U.S. origin claims under 9 CFR 412.3A through C, but with regard to the U.S. state, territory, or locality origin. For example, a single ingredient ground beef label, like the one shown here, that bears the factual claim product of Idaho, may be used provided the product is derived from an animal born, raised, slaughtered, and the meat then processed in Idaho. Here's another example of a label bearing a state claim with a meaningful factual statement. A single ingredient beef product derived from an animal born, raised, and slaughtered in a foreign country, then brought to Kentucky to be sliced and packaged, is labeled with a factual claim, sliced and packaged in Kentucky. Displays of the U.S. flag or a U.S. state or territory flag are permitted on labels of products under FSIS mandatory or voluntary inspection to designate the United States, U.S. state, or U.S. territory origin of single and multi-ingredient products or components of a product's preparation and processing. The display of the flag must meet the requirements for use of voluntary U.S. origin claims under 9 CFR 412.3A through D. For the purposes of the display of a flag that meets the requirements for use of U.S. origin claims other than product of USA and made in the USA under 9 CFR 412.3C or D, the display must be accompanied by a description of the preparation and processing steps that occurred in the United States or in the U.S. state, territory, or locality. So the image on this slide is an example of a U.S. flag with a descriptive qualifying statement made with U.S. beef. This might be used on a multi-ingredient beef product in which some of the ingredients used are not of domestic origin. However, the beef used was born, raised, slaughtered, and processed in the U.S. Here are some key points on the final rule. These claims are not required on labeling. However, establishments may voluntarily include them on product labeling. All voluntary U.S. origin label claims allowed under the final rule will remain eligible for generic approval. The final rule will not impact U.S. exports. FSIS inspectors will continue to verify that exported products meet those requirements that have been officially communicated to FSIS by the importing country. And as a reminder, export requirements can be accessed in the online FSIS export library. Establishments have until the compliance date of January 1st, 2026 to bring labels into compliance or modify or remove the claim. FSIS does not intend to grant temporary label approvals for labels bearing voluntary claims that do not comply on January 1st, 2026. FSIS inspection program personnel will not take enforcement action on labeling that does not comply with the amended regulations before January 1st, 2026. After January 1st, IPP will perform their label verification task just as they do now. The label verification task includes reviewing the label record and all supporting documentation. If the label selected as part of IPP's label verification task includes a voluntary U.S. origin claim, then IPP will review the label record to ensure that the record includes adequate support for the claim. FSIS is updating the directive on generic labeling to include instructions for inspectors for verifying that labels with voluntary U.S. origin claims meet regulatory requirements. FSIS may add additional instructions for verifying state-related claims in the future. Now let's talk about documentation. The final rule does not specify the types of records and documentation that must be maintained to demonstrate compliance with the regulatory criteria. For example, the regulations do not stipulate specific documents such as bills of lading, shipping manifests, load sheets, or grower records. Official establishments and facilities under voluntary inspection choosing to use a voluntary U.S. origin label claim will need to maintain and provide FSIS access to documentation sufficient to demonstrate that the product meets the regulatory criteria for use of the claim and that the claim is not false or misleading, as the regulations require for the use of all generically approved labels. FSIS will accept existing documentation to demonstrate compliance with the applicable regulatory requirements as long as it supports the claim being made. The FSIS compliance guideline for label approval was updated with examples of the types of supporting documentation that may be used to support voluntary U.S. origin claims. The record-keeping requirements, including general examples of types of documentation that may be maintained to support a voluntary U.S. origin claim, are located in 9 CFR 412.3 F and G. On this slide, we have a couple of specific examples of the types of documentation that may be maintained, such as for a product of USA label claim on a single ingredient beef product, records from a ranch located in Wyoming demonstrating that the animal from which the product was derived was born, then raised until slaughter on the ranch. Note that this claim would require additional documentation to support that the product was also slaughtered and processed in the United States. For a sliced and packaged in Maryland label claim on a pork sausage product, records from a processing facility located in Maryland demonstrating that the product was sliced and packaged in the facility. The FSIS compliance guideline for label approval is available on the FSIS website. The guideline helps establishments determine whether their labels must be submitted to the FSIS labeling and program delivery staff for approval. The guidance was updated in March 2024 to include examples of voluntary U.S. origin label claims and the types of documentation that establishments may maintain to support the use of the claims. The guideline was most recently updated in December 2025 to provide additional points of clarification, in part based on Ask FSIS submissions, other industry questions, and public comments on the guideline. The next two slides highlight the most recent updates to the guideline. FSIS clarified that raised means from birth to slaughter for the U.S. origin claims, product of USA and made in USA. When used as a standalone origin claim, for example, beef raised in the U.S., if the animal was not raised domestically from birth to slaughter, the term may be used with qualifying language specifying the number of days raised in the U.S. For example, beef raised at least 30 days in the USA. Clarification was also provided that natural edible casings may be processed, for example, cleaned, in a foreign country and still be considered of domestic origin, provided the animal from which the casing was derived was born, raised, and slaughtered in the United States. FSIS also clarified that the term produced, as with manufactured and processed, is so broad as to not provide meaningful information about what preparation and processing steps occurred in the United States. FSIS provided clarification that non-FSIS inspected multi-ingredient items, such as soy sauce or cheese, must have been produced in the United States to be considered of domestic origin. However, the sub-ingredients within these items, such as the soybeans and wheat within the soy sauce, do not need to be produced in the United States. The guideline was also updated to include the addition and explanation of voluntary claims such as product of USA and Canada and product of North America. Updates were made to the state endorsement program section to address different types of logos, such as those with geographic images or made-in-state language. The guideline now provides additional examples of voluntary U.S. origin claims that may be used to describe the preparation and processing steps of a product that occurred in the U.S. And the guideline now provides additional examples of the types of documentation that may be maintained to support a voluntary U.S. origin claim. This next portion of the presentation will go over some of the most frequently asked questions received since the final rule published. The first question is, does the new rule apply to products for export from the U.S.? And the answer is no. The regulatory requirements for voluntary U.S. origin label claims will not apply to products intended for export from the United States. Additional export requirements maintained by foreign countries that have been officially communicated to FSIS by that importing country can be accessed in the FSIS export library. FSIS inspectors will continue to verify product intended for export meets applicable foreign country requirements. Will FSIS grant a temporary label approval if a label bears the voluntary claim made in the USA or product of USA if the claim does not comply with 9 CFR 412.3 after January 1st, 2026? FSIS will not grant temporary label approvals for these claims. Establishments have until January 1st, 2026 to bring labels into compliance by ensuring that all ingredients produced under FSIS mandatory inspection or voluntary inspection services are derived from animals born, raised, slaughtered, and processed in the United States, and ensuring that all ingredients other than spices and flavorings are of domestic origin, and ensuring that all preparation and processing steps have occurred in the United States. Alternatively, establishments may cover up the claim with a pressure-sensitive sticker, or they may change the claim. The next question is, does the January 1st, 2026 compliance date apply to products in commerce that were packaged and labeled prior to January 1st? The answer is no. Products packaged and labeled in the U.S. with product of USA and made in the USA prior to January 1st, 2026 may remain in commerce with the claims because the claims were in compliance at the time they were applied to product. How do I know what is considered a spice or flavoring in the context of this rule? For the purposes of labeling multi-ingredient products with voluntary U.S. origin claims, for example, product of USA, spices and flavorings are defined in 9 CFR 317.2 F1I A and B for meat, and 9 CFR 381.118 C1 and 2 for poultry. Must all sub-ingredients within a non-FSIS inspected multi-ingredient item, for example, soy sauce or ketchup, be of domestic origin if a label bears a product of USA or made in USA claim? And the answer is no. Non-FSIS inspected multi-ingredient items such as soy sauce must have been produced in the United States to be considered of domestic origin. However, the sub-ingredients within these items, for example, soybeans and wheat in soy sauce, do not need to be produced in the United States. Does the new rule apply to processing aids? No. Ingredients that are present in a meat or poultry product in an insignificant amount and that have no functional or technical effects in the finished meat or poultry product are considered to be processing aids and are exempt from ingredient labeling requirements. The origin of processing aids will not impact the use of a voluntary U.S. origin label claim. Will the new 9 CFR 412.3 labeling regulations related to U.S. origin claims be required on labeling, similar to the required AMS cool labeling requirements? And the answer here is no. U.S. origin claims, such as made in the USA, on meat and poultry products are voluntary. Similarly, qualified claims such as cooked, sliced, and packaged in the U.S. and beef born and raised in the USA are also voluntary. If a product is not eligible to bear these types of claims on labeling after January 1st, 2026, then the claim may be removed. For poultry products labeled with a voluntary U.S. origin claim, when is the poultry considered born in the context of the new regulations? Under the final rule, born in the case of poultry is hatched from the egg. Therefore, poultry hatched in the U.S. will meet the requirement for these claims that the animal was born in the U.S. If the country in which the egg was laid or in which the unhatched egg was handled was a country other than the U.S., this would not exclude the poultry product from bearing a voluntary U.S. origin claim, such as product of USA. For egg products labeled with a voluntary U.S. origin claim, when is the egg product considered born in the context of the new regulations? Under the final rule, born in the case of an egg product is broken from the egg. Therefore, eggs broken in the U.S. will meet the requirement for these claims that the animal was born in the U.S. If a meat or poultry product is derived from animals slaughtered in the U.S., may the label make the claim harvested in the U.S. instead of slaughtered in the U.S.? And the answer here is yes. The term harvested may be used in place of slaughtered on labeling. And our last frequently asked question is when making a qualified U.S. origin claim other than product of USA or made in the USA, must all of the steps that occurred in the U.S. be listed in the claim? The answer is no. Below on this slide, we have some sample claims that may be made on the following scenario. A multi-ingredient pork product that was made from pork born, raised, slaughtered, and processed in the U.S., and all processing steps of the finished product occurred in the U.S. However, one or more ingredients in the product are not of domestic origin. Some examples of voluntary claims that could be made with adequate support are pork born, raised, and harvested in the U.S. without reference to any specific processing steps, cooked, sliced, and packaged in the U.S. without reference to the origin of the animals used in the product, or packaged in the U.S., referencing just one step which occurred in the U.S. Thank you for listening to our presentation today. On this slide, you'll see the address for Ask FSIS, where you can submit questions for a written policy response to questions not only related to the voluntary labeling of U.S. origin claims final rule, which we discussed today, but also to other labeling policy questions and non-labeling policy questions as well. The labeling and program delivery staff can also be reached by telephone for questions, and we have a link on this slide that connects to useful general labeling information. Thank you.